I think there was several missed opportunities within his time as Pope. I wish that more had been done again within the lanes and the bounds of the church to make those changes, not just social media. I think I speak for a lot of lapsed Catholics when I say that it's not without reason that I've kind of stepped away from the church, and a large part of it due to the sex abuse within the church and how abhorrent that I find it, and how frustrated I felt in the aftermath of it that things weren't happening quicker to make changes and to create resolve. This morning it's just me. It's about 6 in the morning, and Abby is away in Spain for this week. But I'm coming at you because the news just broke that Pope Francis died at the age of 88. And this is the day after Easter. It's Monday morning right now. And my friend just texted me. She's in Poland right now, and she's, obviously awake a couple hours ahead of us, just saying like Pope Francis had died. So then I went and, checked the other news outlets, and the Washington Post had just reported it about an hour ago. So I thought it would be a good chance to just hop on, do a little bit of a solo episode moment right now, and give some thoughts about it because I definitely don't really know what I'm gonna say. It's interesting timing, the fact that it happened right after Easter, and we know that he's been sick for a while, so it's not really a shock, but anytime something like this happens, um, it's kind of a scramble for everyone to formulate, what this person represented to them and what their legacy is going to be. And obviously, in the case of the Pope, it's going to set off a new round of selection for the Pope, to see who his replacement's going to be. And that could be an extremely consequential decision depending on who they select. Pope Francis was the first pope from Latin America. He was from Buenos Aires, Argentina, actually. And our listeners know that Abby and I both were in Argentina last year. And Pope Francis is definitely a bit of a folk hero to them there. Everywhere you go in Argentina and Buenos Aires, you tend to see images of Pope Francis and Eva Peron, which is kind of an odd pairing, but that's those are the two people who historically are very notable from that city, and I mean among many others, but their images are everywhere, and he was definitely seen as an icon in that sense, because he wasn't from Europe as all the previous popes had been. A lot of people cited him as kind of a trailblazer, although depending on who you ask, the liberals and the conservatives have very different opinions of him. He could be seen as somewhat divisive in that way. A lot of people thought when he was first elected that he was sort of going to be a champion of the poor, because when he was in Buenos Aires, he had this track record of ministry to the poor, of living a more humble life, and I think people appreciated that about him. I remember when he first got selected, and it was in 2013, I think, and I must have I was only like 10, 11, and so he's been Pope for most of my life, honestly, and I remember when he was selected, everyone was making a pretty big thing of it because he was like riding the public transportation, and he just seemed like he had this sort of populist approach about him that I think appealed to a lot of people. I think people were very hopeful that he was going to bring people into the church, and whether or not that was actually the case in the last 10 years is kind of debatable. Um, Personally, I think he kind of fell flat there in terms of outreach. He's often cited as someone who was trying to bring in marginalized communities and people into the church, obviously including poor people, but then also including LGBTQ people and just others who the church had historically not tried to incorporate. As far as whether or not he was successful in this, again, it's kind of debatable, but actually, I have this newspaper right here. Abby and I used to work for the USC Vista, and here's an issue that we did right after Queen Elizabeth died. We kind of scrambled to write this story within a couple of days after she died, and this was Queen Elizabeth's death. And then we also wrote this story about the Pope because two of our professors were away in Europe, or they had gone to a conference to where they actually met the Pope. And I just wanted to read a little bit of our reporting from back then because I do think it's kind of informative of who he was and what he represented to people and sort of maybe the legacy that he is going to leave behind. So, in this article is by one of Abby and I's friends, Haley Jacob, and she is again writing about these two professors, Professor Aaron Bianco and Dr. Emily Raymer Berry, who are from USD. And they both went to present at this conference for the Pope, um, where they were invited to they submitted these proposals, and there was among like I don't know 600 plus proposals submitted to go present at this conference on different issues related to marriage and family. And both of their proposals were accepted, and they went and presented. So it was kind of a big deal for our university at the time. And so here is a quote from Bianca in our student paper about meeting the Pope. He said, I said to him, Your Holiness, I work with young adults and LGBT people in the United States, and they're leaving the church so often. And he said to me, You need to continue your work with both of those groups because both of them need to hear how much God loves them. So we talked just a little bit more about how I was doing the work. I was so scared walking up, and he made it like you were talking to your grandpa. It's just the way he grabbed your hand and laughed with you. It made it kind of informal, but made it much easier for me to say what I wanted to say. And then they kind of go on to talk about how um, this was something that probably wouldn't have even happened 10 years earlier. Obviously, the church's stance on gay marriage is that it's not allowed, that it's a sin. And this is sort of a very contentious thing, I would say, within the church because in the secular world, there's been this huge push to legalize gay marriage across all the Western world, really, and most Western countries. It's now legal, obviously, including the United States in 2015, and this was all happening during Pope Francis's time as Pope. And so there was sort of this open question about how much is that going to now extend to religion, and is this something that could ever be acceptable within that lane. And Pope Francis, at various different times, had made different statements, like in the media, about how he thought that gay marriage and relationships shouldn't be criminalized. And even though the church was still maintaining its stance that it was sinful, that he didn't think that people should be punished necessarily, and that it was something where he was even open to the idea. We wrote another article at the Vista in 2023 because this was something that was being hotly debated, and he had made indications that he thought that like civil unions could be blessed by priests between gay couples, and this was something that caused a big stir for obvious reasons because it went sort of counter to what the church's position had been. I read somewhere, actually, I read in the Washington Post like a couple 30 minutes ago, that previous popes hadn't even really like used the word gay to describe gay people, and had kind of like danced around the issue quite a bit, and um, weren't really willing to make any concessions whatsoever, like even in when it came to civil unions and partnerships and the blessing of those. And so this was sort of a I would say a landmark thing that Pope Francis was advocating for, but he was doing it within a very like narrow set of constraints where he wasn't making a doctrinal case for why gay marriage should be allowed within the Catholic Church, but he was saying like in the secular world, it shouldn't be a crime and people shouldn't be treated poorly for being gay. So, as far as what this means for his legacy, it's kind of yet to be seen. Obviously, his successor is going to be chosen, and um, we'll see what their stance is. I think Pope Francis was kind of, he came across as more of a liberal, he came across as more of a liberal pope compared to previous ones. And especially when you think about like Pope John Paul, who I think was Pope when I was born, he was a lot more conservative. And he sort of had a bit of like a following within the Catholic Church for his very conservative views. Um, and it's hard, like I wouldn't say that Pope Francis necessarily had like a strong internal following within the church of like people who were really happy with him and the work that he was doing, or people who would like quote him often or cite him as an inspiration. I just don't think he was that to a lot of people. In fact, I think a lot of Catholics were quite disappointed for reasons I've already mentioned, where they thought that he was going to be an advocate for various different groups, including the poor, and, you know, to what extent he was actually successful in being that is debatable. Um, so we'll see as far as how he's remembered. Like I said, I think that Abby and I have talked about Supreme Court justices before, and I've said that I think that when it comes to Supreme Court justices, I like them to be more on the conservative side and to make arguments from an originalist standpoint where their arguments are very solid and rooted in the Constitution, and they're making their decisions in a way that it's not going to later be overturned dramatically just on a whim because people feel like it and they want to change the law. I have the same stance as a Catholic. I think if you're going to be making arguments for more progressive ideas within the church, then they need to be coming from a standpoint of established doctrine. Otherwise, it's just going to be undone later on, or, it's not going to have like a lasting effect. And unfortunately, my opinion is that I think a lot of the work that Francis has done is not going to stick because of what I just said. He wasn't trying to change church doctrine. He was sort of making a lot of public statements and kind of hand waving, but I don't actually think it was changing anything, unfortunately. And he was kind of known and like heralded as the first pope to use social media, and I just think that that's a complete farce. I think it's laughable. I don't give a single crap about a pope's social media presence. I care about, is he competently representing and advocating for Catholic doctrine, and is he making sound judgments and moral claims that are uplifting humanity and leveraging that power that the Vatican has to actually make a real difference for people. And I think there was several missed opportunities within his time as Pope. Um, and I wish that more had been done again within the lanes and the bounds of the church to make those changes, not just social media and appearances in the media. Um, so if if that is his legacy, then I think that that's a missed opportunity. I also think another huge part of this, um, a lot of stuff emerged during Pope Francis's time as Pope about sex abuse within the church. And a lot of this abuse that was alleged had happened during earlier popes, going back to John Paul, I'm sure going back farther than that, and under Pope Benedict, who obviously resigned um, in, I think, 2013. He stepped down and was one of the first popes who had done that in God knows how long, because once people are given that power, it's very hard to let go. So Benedict actually did step down and he died in 2022. But anyway, a lot of things happened during the previous two popes before Francis, allegations of sex abuse within the Catholic Church. And so Pope Francis was kind of stepping into his role as Pope in light of all of that, and I think struggled to again make substantive changes within his own lane that would have actually benefited marginalized people who had been harmed by the Catholic Church. And that to me is I I'm gonna say inexcusable. I think it's honestly pathetic how little was done to rectify the abuse that was brought to light. I'm a Catholic. I was raised Catholic, confirmed Catholic. I would consider myself kind of a lapsed Catholic. Yesterday was Easter. I went to church yesterday, and um, it was wonderful. It was a beautiful church. My first time going back in since Christmas, and it really made me nostalgic. It made me miss being in church and attending church and making that a regular part of my routine. But it's also, I think I speak for a lot of lapsed Catholics when I say that it's not without reason that I've kind of stepped away from the church, and a large part of it due to the sex abuse within the church and how abhorrent that I find it and how frustrated I felt in the aftermath of it that things weren't happening quicker to make changes and to, create resolve. Um, so I remember when I was attending church regularly in high school, and I remember my priest at my home parish just giving this very impassioned kind of spiel about how people within the church would be right to be disappointed in the church's leadership and how they're handling it, and how a lot of priests were just completely despondent over this, and how there's no excuses for it, and how it was a failure on many levels of leadership because a lot of times under previous popes when these allegations had come up or made their way up the ranks of the bureaucracy within the Catholic Church, people would kind of get like shuffled around. So like allegations would emerge, and then the priests who the allegations are against would be like reassigned to a new church so that they could just start over. And unfortunately, this sort of shuffling around and the way that the Vatican was internally handling all of these issues created the potential for more abuse to just proliferate across multiple different parishes. And so this was a huge, huge problem within the church and a complete travesty, complete moral failing. But instead of looking at very specific reasons and policies and beliefs that the church held that might have actually inflamed this whole situation and made it a million times worse than it needed to be. Again, there was just sort of this like shuffling around and um, I think fecklessness. Unfortunately, when I think of Pope Francis, that's a word that comes to mind for me is feckless. Um, in my opinion, as a lapsed Catholic, what should have been done in the aftermath of all of this abuse coming to light, first of all, it should have been way more transparency in the bringing this stuff to light. I think we should have known a lot more and a lot quicker. But then they needed to engage in substantive conversations about why this was happening. And in addition to what I mentioned about the bureaucracy and the shuffling of people around, I think there's a real question about priests not being able to marry. And I think that since there's some precedent in Jesus' own teachings for spiritual leaders needing to maintain the sort of separation between their domestic responsibilities and um, their role as a spiritual leader. And I think that that is sort of the precedent for why priests within the Catholic Church are not able to marry, but it sets up this huge issue where now you have a bunch of people who are like very sexually frustrated who think that becoming a priest is going to solve all of their problems and frustrations, and that's not how that works. If anyone, I mean, I think like lay people can understand that that's not the solution, but when certain I think when people are brought up in the church and they're taught like, oh, sex is bad and you can't have sex until marriage and like all this laundry list of beliefs that the church has about sex, it kind of sets people up for failure, especially if they come from a very traditionally Catholic family and are sexually frustrated, where it one possible solution that they might see is, oh, if I become a priest, then I don't have to ever think about this ever again. And that's not how human nature works. That's not how sex works. I think we can agree. And I don't think I don't think I'm overstepping here. I think that that is part of the problem. No one has really connected these dots. I mean, I've been a Catholic again my entire life, and I've yet to really hear people connect these two things and say, wait, like maybe us making priests be celibate, not allowing priests to marry, is contributing to this problem of sex abuse within the church. And I'm so obviously I'm not trying to give people a pass who have been accused of sexual abuse because I think some people really are just perverted and it doesn't really matter if married or not. Like they're gonna act out and they're gonna do heinous shit that is completely unacceptable. So I'm not saying like if we just allowed priests to get married, then it would make sex abuse within the church go away. I don't believe that. I think some people are really just lost causes and maybe something about the power of being a priest or the access that they're able to get to the community like draws these sick perverted people and sick perverted people are going to do what they do regardless. But I do think as another model that kind of is counter to the Roman Catholic Church, you have a lot of interest right now in Eastern Orthodox Catholicism, where the priests actually are allowed to marry and have families. And I think, from what I can tell, I mean, I have some cousins who are Eastern Orthodox Catholic, and from what I can tell, that actually sets up a very positive dynamic where now the priests in that church, again, separate from the Roman Catholic Church, who are able to have families, it sort of is something that enhances their leadership ability. And by being like a leader in their own family and having a spouse, it sort of gives them more of a well-roundedness that you don't see in a lot of Roman Catholic priests. I don't know, it's like there's something not quite complete about them. Like in some sense, in the best way, they can be a little bit like detached in like very spiritual and very um intellectual, but then in another way, it's sort of like how can they truly minister to people within their community if there's this very important aspect of being a human that they really know nothing about. They have no direct experience with it really, or else they have this very fraught relationship with it that they're not dealing with because they're not in a partnership and they've never really had to be. And anyway, I think I admire the Eastern Orthodox Catholics' approach to this, where their leadership is able to marry. And I think this is a problem within Roman Catholicism that no one is talking about. And no one is talking about actual changes to doctrine that would prevent the sort of depravity and perversion that has been allowed to continue on within the church for far too long. So again, I'm not saying that if we only allowed Catholic priests to get married, then there'd be no sex abuse. That's not at all what I believe. But I do think that we should, in light of what happened in the last 50 plus years within the Catholic Church, we should be trying anything and everything to make sure that that never happens again. And this is just one solution that I came up with as a 23-year-old Catholic, who sometimes goes to mass and not as often as I would like or should, but I don't understand why these conversations aren't happening within the church from the highest levels of leadership, looking for actual solutions. Um, it just seems like a lot of shuffling around and a lot of fecklessness. And I 100% do blame Pope Francis and the previous popes before him for the lack of actual change that has happened in the church. And it's not a surprise to me why people like me who actually have a profound appreciation for organized religion and even in particular Catholicism. I'll be a Catholic my whole life, regardless. Like it's something that is so a part of who I am that it I could never fully separate myself from no matter how much I wanted to, and I don't want to. I don't want to be separated from my Catholic identity whatsoever. But when I see the level of incompetence and like bureaucratic mismanagement that goes on in the Vatican, and the level of just like wealth and power that they have at their disposal, but don't, in my opinion, really leverage or put to good use to make worldwide global changes that benefit everyone. It's no surprise to me why people like me are put off by Catholicism and, aren't really all that enthused to maintain attendance at church or give money to the church, especially. And this is really unfortunate because it doesn't need to be this way. I think there's such a hunger right now for actual leadership and spiritual understanding. My generation especially like needs that more than any other. I think we're living in a time of just kind of all around depravity where people feel unable to connect with others in a meaningful way. People feel very detached from a sense of meaning and purpose within their own lives. And if the church was doing what it should do, and this reflects poorly on Pope Francis, if it was doing what it should do, then it should be filling that gap for people and offering them a blueprint for a meaningful life that is missing in society right now. And instead, I feel like the church has just been doing damage control on its own PR issues and making very contradictory statements publicly versus, like in the press versus behind closed doors at conferences and whatnot, and the actual doctrine decisions that they make. And yeah, I just think it's a complete missed opportunity. And as far as Francis's legacy, I kind of opened talking about a lot of more positive and potentially good things about his legacy, and I hopefully I'll end on that as well. But just I think what a missed opportunity, and I think a lot of Catholics feel that way as well. A missed opportunity to provide real meaning and a profound appreciation for organized religion that could help a lot of people, but instead, people are being turned away by these real systemic issues within the church that are very hard to contend with and look past. And we shouldn't be expected to look past them either because they're egregious and pretty much the worst of what humanity is capable of, I think. So, anyway, yeah, I mean, I'd like to end it on a positive note and say that I'm full of optimism for the Catholic Church, especially after I went to Mass yesterday and really had a good experience of it. Um, but it's not gonna be fixed, I don't think, within the next couple of popes. I think it's gonna take a really long time to actually affect change from within the church and to make a substantive difference. One of the things mentioned in this article, when they're talking about visiting the Pope, the Vatican, one of the professors says that things tend to move at a snail's pace within, any bureaucratic sort of institution. And, the church is no exception to that, but it's unfortunate because I think the church has an outsized role to play globally. And so any amount of um, lagging or any amount of um, delay is going to have real consequences for people around the world. And so yeah, I just wish that the church would kind of get its act together a bit and hopefully, I was gonna say I wanted to end this on an optimistic note, but this is really the only hope that I have to offer. I hope that the next pope is able to do that, to kind of cut through all of the crap and all of the bureaucratic nonsense and actually put aside the outsized power that I think that the Vatican has maintained and not used for the good of everyday people around the world, and to actually affect change from within and using church doctrine, making arguments from a place that is grounded in Catholic doctrine and tradition, but is also understanding of where people are at and why people are so disaffected with the by the church and why they feel like the church hasn't been offering them the meaning and the purpose that it could. So that's all I gotta say about that. No traditional episode of Washed Up this week because Abby is traveling in Spain, but I'm sure we'll revisit all of this when she's back, and she'll have a lot to say about it too because she's also was raised Catholic, went to Catholic school, and as we talked about before, she remembers watching Pope Francis get selected as the next pope um, while she was attending elementary school, I think. So we'll be covering that as they choose the next pope, and um, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I wonder if so. Pope Francis was the first pope from Latin America, but I wonder if we're going to see the first North American pope or the first African pope or the first Asian pope. Like I don't know. I think the church is now a global institution, and so the way that that is going to affect their selection process and who they ultimately select is interesting. It's really the next pope could come from anywhere, I think, and it'll be interesting to see if the next pope also sort of breaks some of the tradition that people felt like Pope Francis was breaking down, or whether or not it'll sort of be a continuation of um, what we've seen previously. So I'll just leave it at that.